History is often written in violence, but the Fourth Crusade was written in the ink of betrayal and the stench of catastrophic misjudgment. It is a story that defies the very logic of holy war, where the supposed warriors of God never saw a single infidel on the battlefield, but instead chose to tear out the throat of their own brothers in faith. Imagine a journey fueled by divine promise that ended in a desperate bargain. This is not a tale of heroes, it is a dark thriller of greed, political incompetence, and a series of catastrophic errors that permanently broke the spine of the Christian world. To understand the horror of what happened within the walls of Constantinople, one must first understand the desperate, hollowed-out state of Europe at the end of the 12th century. The stage was set by a vacuum of power and a mountain of debt. Saladin, the great Kurdish sultan who had unified the Muslim world and reclaimed Jerusalem, was dead. He had passed into legend, leaving behind a legacy of chivalry that even his enemies respected. He died so poor because of his charity that his family had to borrow money for his funeral. But while his heirs were busy squabbling over the scraps of his empire, the West saw an opportunity. Pope Innocent III, a man of iron will and boundless ambition, called for a new crusade to finally finish what the Third Crusade had failed to do. He wanted Jerusalem, but more importantly, he wanted power. He devised a strategy that was tactically sound but logistically impossible. Instead of marching across the brutal deserts of Anatolia, the Crusaders would strike at the heart of the enemy by sea, targeting Egypt. But there was a problem that would haunt this campaign from the first day: the Crusaders were broke. They had the zeal of martyrs but the pockets of beggars. They turned to Venice, the transport empire of the medieval world, a city-state of merchants and sharks who saw the cross as a business opportunity. The Venetians agreed to build a massive fleet to transport 36,000 men. The price was 85,000 silver marks, a king's ransom. However, when the time came to sail, only 12,000 men showed up. The rest were stuck at home, broke or disillusioned. The Crusaders were short by tens of thousands of marks, and the Venetians, led by the blind and cunning Doge Enrico Dandolo, weren't running a charity. They locked the Crusaders on an island, essentially holding them hostage until the debt was settled. This was the first turn of the screw. The holy warriors were now prisoners of their own logistics. To pay off the debt, the Crusaders committed their first great sin. They became mercenaries for Venice. They attacked Zara, a Christian city on the Dalmatian coast, simply because it was a trade rival to Venice. The Pope was furious. He excommunicated the entire army. Imagine the psychological weight of that moment. You leave your home to fight for the salvation of your soul, and before you even reach the Holy Land, you have slaughtered your fellow Christians and been cast out of the church. The army was now a leaderless mob, drifting in a sea of guilt and looking for a way out. It was at this moment of maximum vulnerability that a young man appeared like a mirage in the desert. Prince Alexios Angelos, a refugee from the Byzantine Empire, arrived with a golden tongue and a bag full of lies. Alexios was a braggart, a man who possessed the arrogance of royalty without any of the competence. His father, the emperor, had been blinded and thrown into a dungeon by his own brother. Alexios promised the Crusaders everything they wanted to hear. If they would just sail to Constantinople and put him on the throne, he would pay off their entire debt to Venice. He promised them 200,000 silver marks, 10,000 soldiers for the crusade, and the ultimate prize: he would bring the Eastern Orthodox Church under the authority of the Pope, healing the great schism that had divided East and West for centuries. It was an offer too good to be true, and in the world of dark thrillers, such offers always come with a hidden price. The Crusaders, desperate to regain their standing with the Pope and their financial freedom, bit the hook. Constantinople was the jewel of the world, a city of 1 million people when London and Paris were little more than muddy villages. It was the last remnant of the Roman Empire, a fortress of marble and gold that had stood for 1,000 years. But inside its mighty walls, the empire was rotting. It was led by a line of emperors who were more concerned with court intrigue than defense.
What are our orders?
When the Crusader fleet arrived, the Byzantines looked down from their walls with a mixture of contempt and fear. They saw the Latins as barbarians, and the Latins saw the Greeks as effeminate heretics. The tension was not just political, it was a deep, ancient theological hatred. The two sides of the same faith had been arguing for centuries over words in the creed and the authority of the Pope. Now, that hatred was about to boil over. The Crusaders succeeded in putting Alexios IV on the throne, but the victory was hollow. When the young emperor opened the vaults of the imperial treasury, he found nothing but dust. The empire was bankrupt. He couldn't pay the Crusaders, he couldn't unify the churches because his own people hated him for bringing the Western dogs into the house, and he couldn't command his own army. He was a puppet with no one left to pull the strings. For months, the Crusaders waited outside the city walls, their anger simmering in the summer heat. They were hungry, they were unpaid, and they were tired of being lied to. Inside the city, the populace revolted. They murdered Alexios IV and replaced him with a nationalist zealot, Alexios V, a man who hated the West with every fiber of his being. He looked at the Crusaders and told them they would not get a single penny. He dared them to do their worst. And so, the Holy Army turned its blades toward the greatest Christian city on earth. The siege was brief but brutal. On April 12, 1204, the walls that had resisted the Huns, the Persians, and the Arabs finally crumbled under the weight of Latin greed. What followed was 3 days of horror that would be remembered as one of the darkest stains in human history. The Crusaders, the men who wore the cross of Christ on their shoulders, went on a rampage of looting, killing, and desecration that shocked even their own contemporaries. This was not a war of conquest, it was a war of annihilation. They didn't just want the gold, they wanted to humiliate the very soul of the Byzantine people. The accounts of the sack of Constantinople read like a fever dream of madness. The Hagia Sophia, the most beautiful church in Christendom, was stripped of its gold and silver. But the ultimate insult occurred at the very altar of the great church. The Crusaders brought in a common prostitute, a dancer from the streets, and sat her on the throne of the patriarch. They watched in stunned silence as she sang crude songs and performed a scandalous dance in the most sacred space of the Eastern world. This was the theological vengeance for centuries of perceived slights. They were not just stealing treasure, they were violating the very identity of a civilization. Nuns were dragged from their convents and brutalized in the streets. Ancient libraries were torched, and centuries of Greek wisdom were lost to the flames because the mob couldn't read the words on the parchment. The Pope, upon hearing the news, was struck with horror. He had wanted the churches unified, but not like this. He realized that the Crusaders had destroyed the very thing they were supposed to protect. By weakening the Byzantine Empire, they had removed the only barrier protecting Europe from the rising powers of the East. The Fourth Crusade did not win back Jerusalem, it ensured that Jerusalem would stay in Muslim hands for centuries. It was a tactical success for Venice, which walked away with the lion's share of the spoils and a maritime empire, but it was a spiritual and political suicide for the rest of Christendom. The aftermath was a grim shadow of what could have been. The Crusaders declared a Latin Empire of Constantinople, which lasted for a pathetic 60 years. It became a government of thugs and debt collectors who ruled over a population that loathed them. The Byzantine remnants fled to the hills, waiting for their chance to reclaim their home. They eventually succeeded, but the empire they won back was a ghost. Its wealth was gone, its walls were cracked, and its spirit was broken. The Fourth Crusade had turned the Eastern Mediterranean into a graveyard of ambition. When we look back at these events through the lens of a dark thriller, the most chilling part is the human element, the question of why. Why did these men, who believed they were doing God's work, commit such atrocities? The answer lies in the toxic mix of religious extremism and financial desperation. When people feel cheated, when they feel their identity is under threat, and when they are led by young braggarts and greedy merchants, the capacity for evil becomes limitless. The Crusaders didn't see the Byzantines as brothers, they saw them as a debt to be collected. They didn't see the Hagia Sophia as a house of God, they saw it as a gold mine. The legacy of the Fourth Crusade is still with us today. The deep rift between the Catholic and Orthodox churches, the historical tension between the Balkans and the West, and the eventual fall of Constantinople to the Ottomans can all be traced back to those 3 days in April 1204. It serves as a reminder that the road to hell is not just paved with good intentions, it is often paved with unpaid bills and the arrogance of those who think they know the mind of God. It is a story of how a holy movement can be hijacked by the lowest of human impulses. Think of the irony of the Venetian merchants. While the Crusaders were committing murder, the Venetians were carefully cataloging the art. They stole the 4 bronze horses that now sit in St. Mark's Square. They turned the war into a logistics triumph. They were the only true winners in this tragedy. They understood that in a world of religious fervor, the man who controls the ships and the debt controls the world. They watched as the Byzantine heritage was dismantled piece by piece, and they grew fat on the spoils. It was a masterclass in cynicism. The tragedy of the Byzantine emperors is equally profound. They were the heirs to Caesar and Constantine, yet they acted like petulant children. They failed to see the danger at their gates because they were too busy plotting against their own family members. The braggart Prince Alexios and the extremist Alexios V were two sides of the same coin, incompetent leaders who sacrificed their people for their own vanity. They let their empire burn because they couldn't find the wisdom to negotiate or the courage to lead. As the smoke cleared over the Bosphorus, the world had changed. The dream of a unified Christian front was dead. The crusading ideal was exposed as a hollow sham. The Fourth Crusade proved that the cross could be used as a crowbar just as easily as a symbol of sacrifice. It remains a cautionary tale for any age. Beware the leader who promises easy gold. Beware the merchant who offers to ship your ideals, and most of all, beware the moment when you begin to see your neighbor's sanctuary as a target for your own rage. Today, if you visit Istanbul and walk through the Hagia Sophia, you can still feel the weight of those centuries. The echoes of the Latin screams and the Greek cries are buried deep in the stone. History doesn't forget, and it rarely forgives. The Fourth Crusade stands as a monument to what happens when faith loses its way and finds itself in the service of the purse. It was a crusade of the broke, by the greedy, and for the hollow, a dark thriller that ended not with a bang of glory, but with the whimpering of a civilization sold for 200,000 marks. It is a story that reminds us that the greatest dangers often come from within, and the most brutal enemies are often the ones we once called brothers. The lesson is simple but terrifying. Once the blood starts flowing in the name of a debt, even the holiest of men can become the most savage of monsters. This was the Fourth Crusade, a tragedy of errors, a masterpiece of betrayal, and a permanent scar on the face of history.